The heavy silence in hospital room 302 was broken only by the steady beep of medical equipment. Robert Miller lay motionless, his once robust frame now frail beneath the white sheets. Outside the door, an unprecedented scene unfolded. Medical staff nervously watched as wildlife handlers guided an enormous brown bear down the sterile hallway. Nobody believed this would work. Nobody thought it was possible. Yet here was Kodiak, a 900-pound bear, being brought to say his final goodbye to the man who had raised him. What happened in the next few minutes would leave everyone present with tears streaming down their faces, forever changing how they understood the bond between humans and animals. For over 30 years, Robert Miller had dedicated his life to rescuing and rehabilitating wildlife in the mountains of Montana. His sanctuary, Pine Ridge Wildlife Haven, sprawled across 40 acres of woodland where injured eagles soared again and orphaned deer found safe haven. At 68, Robert had become something of a legend in wildlife conservation circles. His weathered face told stories of countless rescues, his calloused hands had mended broken wings, and his gentle voice had soothed frightened animals. Among all the creatures Robert had saved over the decades, none had formed such an unexpected bond with him as Kodiak. The massive brown bear had come to the sanctuary 15 years ago as a tiny, helpless cub. Forest rangers had found him whimpering beside his mother, who had been killed by poachers. With no chance of survival alone in the wild, the trembling cub was brought to Robert. Most rescued bears were eventually released back into the wilderness, but Kodiak was different. Having been orphaned so young, he never developed the necessary skills to survive independently. The sanctuary became his permanent home, and Robert became the closest thing to family the bear had known. Over the years, visitors to Pine Ridge marveled at the unusual friendship between the man and the massive bear. Robert was the only person who could enter Kodiak's enclosure without fear, the only one who understood the gentle giant's habits and moods. Now, as Robert's life ebbed away, an extraordinary plan was being set in motion, one that would reveal the true depth of this remarkable bond. Spring had just begun to touch the Montana wilderness when Robert received the urgent call from forest rangers. A female brown bear had been found dead, killed by poachers seeking her gallbladder for the black market. But that was not all they discovered. Huddled against his mother's lifeless body was a trembling cub, barely 2 months old. The rangers knew exactly who to call. Robert drove his old pickup truck deep into the forest, following the coordinates given to him. When he arrived at the clearing, the sight broke his heart. The tiny cub was still nuzzling his mother, confused by her stillness. His soft whimpers echoed through the trees. The forest ranger stood at a distance, unsure how to approach the frightened baby bear. With practiced calm, Robert slowly moved toward the cub. Years of experience had taught him the delicate art of gaining an animal's trust. He spoke in soft, soothing tones, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. After nearly an hour of patient coaxing, the hungry, exhausted cub finally allowed Robert to wrap him in a warm blanket. Back at the sanctuary, Robert named him Kodiak. The cub weighed just 12 pounds, with oversized paws that hinted at his future size. For weeks, Robert slept beside Kodiak's enclosure, bottle feeding him every few hours. The little bear would curl up against the wire mesh, as close as possible to a human who would become his surrogate parent. As months passed, Kodiak grew at an astonishing rate. By his second year, he already weighed over 400 pounds. Yet despite his increasing size and strength, he maintained a remarkably gentle demeanor. Robert had attempted to minimize human contact, knowing that rehabilitation usually meant eventual release. But Kodiak showed no signs of developing the necessary wild instincts. His early trauma and hand-raised beginnings had left him too dependent on human care. What began as a temporary arrangement became permanent. Kodiak's enclosure was expanded multiple times over the years to accommodate his growing size. By his 10th birthday, he had reached his full impressive stature of nearly 900 pounds, with massive paws and a thick, glossy coat that shimmered in the sunlight. Their daily ritual remained unchanged for 15 years. Each morning, Robert would arrive with breakfast, talking to Kodiak as a conversing with an old friend. The massive bear would amble over, his movements surprisingly graceful for his bulk, and sit patiently while Robert cleaned his enclosure. Visitors often gasped when they saw the giant bear gently take apples from Robert's hand or playfully splash in his pond when Robert turned on the hose during summer heat. Wildlife experts who visited the sanctuary were amazed by the unusual relationship. Kodiak remained a wild animal with natural instincts intact, yet he showed a level of trust and affection toward Robert that defied conventional understanding of bear behavior. It was as if the bear somehow knew he had been saved and had never forgotten. The change began subtly. Robert started feeling unusually tired after his morning rounds at the sanctuary. His appetite diminished, and a persistent pain in his abdomen troubled him for weeks before he finally agreed to see a doctor. The diagnosis came like a thunderbolt on a clear day. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, already spread to his liver. The doctor spoke of months, not years. At first, Robert refused to accept the prognosis. He continued his work at the sanctuary, though his movements grew slower and his face more gaunt with each passing week. The staff noticed how he would pause to catch his breath, leaning against fence posts, how his clothes hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Yet every morning, without fail, he would visit Kodiak, bringing the bear's favorite fruits and talking to him in the same gentle voice he had used since the day they met. It was during a particularly cold October morning when Robert collapsed while preparing Kodiak's breakfast. The sanctuary staff found him unconscious near the food preparation area. The ambulance arrived within 20 minutes, sirens piercing the usual calm of the wildlife haven. As paramedics loaded Robert onto a stretcher, a deep, mournful sound echoed across the sanctuary. Kodiak, as if sensing something was terribly wrong, stood on his hind legs at the edge of his enclosure, calling out in distress. At the regional hospital, doctors confirmed what Robert already knew. The cancer had accelerated its cruel march. His body was failing rapidly, and the medical team recommended he remain hospitalized. Pain management became the primary concern as Robert's once strong body surrendered to the disease that consumed it. From his hospital bed, Robert made one request that stunned both medical staff and his family. His voice was weak but determined as he expressed his final wish, to see Kodiak one last time. The hospital administrator initially dismissed the idea as impossible. Bringing a nearly 1,000-pound wild bear into a medical facility seemed not just impractical, but potentially dangerous. Yet Robert persisted, growing more adamant as his strength ebbed. "He's more than just an animal I saved," Robert whispered to his daughter Emma as she sat beside his bed. "I need to say goodbye. He won't understand why I never came back." Emma Miller sat with her siblings in the hospital cafeteria, their coffee growing cold as they debated their father's unusual request. As a wildlife veterinarian herself, Emma understood the bond between her father and Kodiak better than most. Her brother Michael, always practical, listed all the reasons it was impossible. Her sister Sarah remained torn, wanting to fulfill their father's wish but fearing the risks involved. "Dad is dying," Emma finally said, her voice breaking the tense silence. "If his last wish is to see that bear, then we need to find a way to make it happen." The hospital administration was firmly against the idea. The liability issues alone were overwhelming. The hospital director, Dr. Patel, explained the impossibility of allowing a wild predator into a facility filled with vulnerable patients. The insurance company would never approve. The risk management team considered it absolutely out of the question. "This is a hospital, not a zoo," stated the head of security flatly during an emergency meeting called to address Robert's request. Yet as Robert's condition rapidly deteriorated, Emma refused to give up. She contacted the sanctuary staff, wildlife authorities, and even the governor's office. With her father's reputation in conservation circles, doors began to open. The media caught wind of the story, and public sentiment swelled in support of the dying man's final wish. After 3 days of negotiations, a compromise emerged. Robert would be moved temporarily to a private room with direct exterior access on the ground floor, away from other patients. The visit would occur at dawn on Sunday, when the hospital corridors were least crowded. The wildlife team would bring Kodiak in a specially reinforced transport cage, sedated just enough to keep him calm, without compromising his awareness. Preparations began immediately. The sanctuary team constructed a specialized transport container, reinforced with steel bars yet comfortable enough for the massive bear. They spent days acclimating Kodiak to this temporary enclosure, feeding him inside it and ensuring he felt secure. Wildlife veterinarians calculated the exact dosage of mild sedatives that would reduce Kodiak's anxiety without fully sedating him. Meanwhile, hospital maintenance created a temporary pathway from the parking lot directly to Robert's room, bypassing all public areas. Security cameras were installed along the route, and fire doors were programmed to seal off the section if necessary. Every staff member received detailed instructions, and a team of wildlife handlers volunteered to be present. Liability waivers were signed by all parties involved. As dawn approached on the designated Sunday, Emma looked out the window of her father's room, watching the specialized transport vehicle pull into the parking lot. Despite all the precautions and planning, nobody could predict how Kodiak would react to the unfamiliar environment, the strange smells, or the sight of Robert in his weakened state. Everyone involved knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that could either go terribly wrong or become an extraordinary moment of connection. The pre-dawn air hung cold and still as the specialized transport vehicle made its careful journey from Pine Ridge Sanctuary to Memorial Hospital. Inside, Kodiak lay quietly, the mild sedative taking the edge off his anxiety without dulling his senses. 3 experienced wildlife handlers accompanied him, monitoring his breathing and behavior through small observation windows. They spoke in hushed tones, their breath visible in the chilly air of the vehicle. At the hospital, a small crowd had gathered despite the early hour. News of the unusual visit had leaked, drawing a handful of reporters and curious onlookers who were kept at a distance by police barricades. Hospital security stood at attention, their faces betraying the tension everyone felt. The wildlife team had rehearsed the procedure multiple times, yet everyone knew that no amount of planning could fully prepare them for bringing a 900-pound bear into a hospital room. Emma waited by her father's bedside, holding his thin hand. Robert had been awake since 3 a.m., a renewed energy temporarily masking his pain as he anticipated seeing Kodiak one last time. The hospital room had been modified, all unnecessary equipment removed, the bed positioned to allow maximum space, and a clear path to the exterior door established. "They're here," whispered a nurse, peering through the window blinds of the transport vehicle that had just arrived. 4 wildlife handlers positioned themselves at the corners of Kodiak's transport enclosure as it was carefully unloaded from the vehicle. Moving with slow, deliberate steps, they guided the massive container along the designated pathway. The only sounds were their occasional quiet commands to each other and the soft scraping of the container's wheels against the pavement. When they reached the exterior door to Robert's room, they paused. The lead handler, Marcus, a man who had worked at the sanctuary for over a decade, wiped sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. Through the small observation window, he could see Kodiak was alert, sniffing the air curiously. The bear seemed calm, but everyone knew how quickly that could change. The door slid open. Emma stepped back, her heart pounding as the transport container was maneuvered into the room. The medical staff had retreated to the hallway, monitoring Robert's vital signs remotely. A wildlife veterinarian stood ready with additional sedatives should Kodiak become agitated. Robert raised himself slightly on his pillows, his eyes fixed on the container that held his old friend. "Kodiak," he called, his voice weak but clear. "I'm here, buddy." The room fell completely silent as Marcus carefully opened the transport container's door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Kodiak's massive head emerged, his brown eyes blinking in the unfamiliar fluorescent light. His nostrils flared as he took in the strange smells of the hospital room. Everyone held their breath as the enormous bear fully emerged from the container, standing at his full height just feet away from Robert's bed. The initial moments were tense. Kodiak seemed confused, his head swinging from side to side as he assessed the unfamiliar environment. The handlers gripped their control poles tightly, ready to intervene. Emma pressed herself against the wall, torn between fear for her father's safety and awe at the sheer presence of the magnificent animal. Here's the section about the unexpected moment. For several tense heartbeats, Kodiak remained still, his massive frame seeming to fill the small hospital room. His dark eyes scanned his surroundings, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar antiseptic smells. The wildlife handlers kept their positions, control poles at the ready, exchanging nervous glances as they prepared for any sudden movements. Then Kodiak's gaze fell upon Robert. The bear tilted his head, as if puzzled by the sight of his caretaker, lying so still and frail on the strange bed. A soft rumble emanated from his throat, not threatening but questioning. "Kodiak," Robert whispered again, extending a trembling hand toward the bear. "Come here, boy." What happened next left everyone in the room frozen in astonishment. Instead of showing agitation or fear in this strange environment, Kodiak slowly approached Robert's bedside. His movements were cautious, almost delicate, as though he somehow sensed the fragility of the situation. The handlers tensed, ready to intervene, but Marcus, the lead handler, raised his hand slightly, signaling them to wait. When Kodiak reached the edge of the bed, he lowered his massive head until it was level with Robert's outstretched hand. His breathing was calm, his eyes focused entirely on the man who had raised him. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a powerful creature, Kodiak nuzzled his nose against Robert's palm. Robert smiled weakly, tears beginning to stream down his hollow cheeks. "There you are," he murmured. "I knew you'd understand." Then came the moment that would be etched forever in the memories of everyone present. Kodiak raised one enormous paw, a paw that could easily crush with a single swipe, and with astonishing tenderness, placed it on the bed beside Robert's arm, not touching him, not bearing any weight, just resting it there as if offering comfort. Emma covered her mouth, unable to contain a sob. The nurses watching from the doorway wiped tears from their eyes. Even Marcus, who had worked with wildlife for 20 years, found himself overwhelmed by the scene before him. But Kodiak wasn't finished. As if sensing that this was no ordinary visit, the bear made a sound none of them had heard before, a low, mournful vocalization that seemed to carry the weight of goodbye. He then leaned forward and gently pressed his forehead against Robert's chest, remaining there for several long moments, completely still except for the rhythm of his breathing. Robert placed his hand on Kodiak's head, his fingers disappearing into the thick fur. "You've been the best friend," he whispered, his voice breaking. "The very best." When Kodiak finally raised his head, the bear did something that defied all expectations of animal behavior. He carefully licked Robert's cheek, once, then again, in what appeared to be an act of comfort and affection. It was as if the bear was trying to ease his friend's pain in the only way he knew how. Dr. Jennings, who had insisted on being present despite her skepticism about the whole endeavor, stood speechless in the corner of the room. In all her years of medicine, she had never witnessed anything like this. What she was seeing challenged everything she thought she understood about animal cognition and emotion. For nearly 15 minutes, Kodiak remained by Robert's side, occasionally making soft sounds or shifting his position slightly, but never moving away. No one dared disturb this extraordinary communion between man and bear. The handlers gradually relaxed their vigilance, recognizing that Kodiak presented no danger in this moment. Through it all, Robert continued to speak softly to his old friend, words too quiet for others to hear. Private communications between two beings whose connection transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild animal. The tears that had begun on Robert's cheeks were now mirrored on the faces of everyone in the room. Even those who had initially opposed his visit stood transfixed, deeply moved by the profound understanding they were witnessing. No one in that hospital room had expected to be so profoundly affected by what they witnessed between Robert and Kodiak. The raw emotion that filled the space transcended professional detachment and personal skepticism. Nurses who had seen countless moments of human connection found themselves wiping away tears. Wildlife handlers who had always maintained a respectful distance from the animals in their care stood speechless, moved beyond words. What broke through their composure was not simply the gentleness of Kodiak's behavior, but the undeniable intentionality behind it. This was no trained performance or coincidental interaction. The bear's actions, the careful placement of his paw, the gentle nuzzling, the soft vocalizations, revealed an awareness that challenged fundamental assumptions about the emotional capacity of wild animals. Dr. Patel, who had initially opposed the visit most strongly, leaned against the wall for support visibly shaken. "In 30 years of medicine," she whispered to Emma, "I've never seen anything like this." It's as if he knows. Emma nodded through her tears, unable to speak. She had grown up watching her father's special connection with Kodiak, but even she had never fully appreciated the depth of their bond until this moment. What she was witnessing wasn't just an animal recognizing its caretaker. It was a genuine exchange of comfort and farewell between two beings who had shared a life journey. For the wildlife team, the realization carried professional implications that would forever change their approach to animal cognition. Marcus later confessed that he would never again view the animals in his care through the same limited lens. The most powerful moment came when Robert's monitor briefly alarmed as his heart rate dropped. Kodiak, seemingly responding to the change in his friend's condition, pressed his large head gently against Robert's chest and remained there, completely still, as if lending his strength. When Robert's vital signs stabilized, the medical staff exchanged looks of astonishment. In that quiet room, barriers between species seemed to dissolve, revealing a universal language of compassion that everyone present could understand. They weren't just witnessing an animal's behavior. They were being given a rare glimpse into profound capacity for connection that exists in nature, often hidden from human understanding. 3 days after Kodiak's visit, Robert Miller passed away peacefully in his sleep. Though hospital policy had prevented the bear from returning, Emma had placed a small tuft of Kodiak's fur in her father's hand during his final hours. The nurses said Robert had clutched it tightly until the very end, a smile occasionally crossing his face as if remembering his friend. Back at the sanctuary, Kodiak's behavior changed in subtle but noticeable ways. The normally social bear retreated to the far corner of his enclosure for several days after the visit, refusing most food and ignoring the staff. When he finally emerged, sanctuary workers observed him standing motionless for long periods, gazing in the direction of the parking area where Robert's truck had always appeared each morning. It was as if he somehow sensed that his old friend would never return. The story of Robert and Kodiak spread far beyond the small Montana community. Wildlife biologists, conservationists, and animal behaviorists arrived at Pine Ridge Sanctuary to study Kodiak and learn from those who had witnessed the extraordinary hospital visit. Research papers were published discussing the implications for understanding animal grief and emotional bonds. What had once been dismissed as anthropomorphism was now being seriously considered as evidence of complex emotional lives in animals previously thought incapable of such depth. For the medical staff who had been present, the experience fundamentally altered their perspective. Dr. Patel established a new program allowing therapy animals in more areas of the hospital. Nurses reported being more attentive to the emotional needs of their patients, having witnessed the healing power of connection in its purest form. Emma took over the sanctuary's operations, inspired by her father's legacy. Under her guidance, Pine Ridge expanded its educational programs, sharing the story of Robert and Kodiak to promote wildlife conservation and a deeper understanding of the emotional lives of animals. Kodiak, now an ambassador for his species, continued to demonstrate the gentle nature that had so moved everyone in that hospital room. If you found this story touching, consider subscribing to our channel for more remarkable tales of the incredible bonds between humans and animals. Every day, we share extraordinary stories that reveal the emotional depth of the animal kingdom and the special connections that change lives. Join our community and never miss another heartwarming moment that shows us how much we still have to learn from the natural world.